Hello, ladies and gents. We're on the model A328. How are empires experienced? Page 146. African resistance to imperialism. Page 146. The call to arms started with drumming, which stopped all work and all conversation. Then the proclamation was made. Within minutes, men were riding off in all directions to relay the news. Shield, lance, rifle, and 10 days' supply of food. These were the requirements of the soldier. Women prepared thick bread cakes. Horns were filled with red peppers and butter. Cartridge belts were slipped over the shoulder or around the waist. Rifle muzzles were stuffed with scraps of wood or a rag to keep out dirt on the march. Swords were strapped to the right hip, following Ethiopian custom. All able bodied men answered the call to arms, and from the local district they moved towards established rendezvous points on your point today. Ad hoc recruitment served Ethiopia well, notably in its struggle against Ethiopian expansion. The risk in such a informal system, of course, was the threat of disloyalty. Menelik was the king of Ethiopia, a position he had clawed his way into from his secure base as king of Shoa. As emperor, he relied upon a web of relationships that depended variously on blood, marriage, trust, and fear. In the end, the success of the mobilization would depend on the strength of those relationships. Menelek's closest supporters included his cousin, Maconian, Weli, brother of Empress Tatu, and Michael, a convert from Islam and a viceroy in the land of the Wallo Oromo. But he also needed Mangasha, the resentful son of the Emperor Yohannes and restless governor of Tigray, Tekele Hymenot, the king of Gojam and rival for the throne, and Aluda, a patriot who resented Menelek's dealings with the Italians. These relationships would be tested on the march. Some would fray up until the eve of Adwa. Italian strategic assessment crackled with speculation about who might peel away from Menelik leaving his army and Ethiopia itself. Exposed to fatal division, Menelik would lead a march northward from Addis Ababa. Starting on 11th October, troops in the south were instructed to coverage on Waraloo, 155 miles northeast of the capital, while subordinates farther north were to join him en route at Lakes Assange and Mekelle, respectively 250 to 310 miles north of Addis. These northerly assembly points would save the men the trouble of marching south to Addis and only march north. They would also reduce the colossal footprint of Menelik's army. The Ethiopian peasants were happy enough to produce tribute for Menelik on his way north. But there could be no mistaking. The devastation the passing of the Emperor army could inflict. There were limits to hospitality. When Menelek's army eventually headed south again after the Battle of Adwa, villagers would be far from pleased to see the Emperor again. Menelik and Tatu travelled with the pomp, but also the purpose of Renaissance court. There was no controversial military campaign. With every step, the imperial couple would be testing public opinion and the loyalty of those who had pledged to join the defence of Ethiopia. The imperial court proceeded at a stately pace, whenever the terrain allowed it. The troops of Ras Michael and Ras Weli peeled away from the main army. flanking Menelek's troops in columns on either side. These dispersed movements minimised bottlenecks, enhanced security, and reduced the impact on population. These parallel armies widened trails as they went, undaunted in their progress as they crossed adjacent passes, securing the way of the emperor. They formed a spectacle of billowing sharmas and bobbing rifles and lances, the mark of the citizens' army. One chronicler, the pageantry of the event, recounting how drums beat and trumpets blared, as if so say, courage and fortune is yours. While minstrels sang in mock astonishment, oh wonder, they came to conquer Abyssinia, crossing the sea on the boat. Tatu gloried in a march that radiated splendour and power. Her entourage dwarfed all about the emperors, which she followed on march, and mounted soldiers sounded a shrill horn to announce her imminent arrival. Then come a miniature guard, followed by the empress herself, veiled and mounted on a mule or horseback. Tadjo's mount was led by Boucher, a trusted lieutenant and a Nut who, along with the jobs of imperial treasurer, a chief artilleryman, had the honour of holding the imperial reins. She was followed at a distance by a formation of women also mounted and arrayed in a semicircle. Each member of the empress entourage carried a brightly coloured umbrella, forming a throbbing cluster of colour at the heart of the march. Menelik was in no great hurry. Plenty of sacrifices lay ahead, and speed now would only thin mules, horses, and men at a time when they needed to protect the healthy reserve. But there were political and ceremonial reasons for their stately pace too. Menelik and Tadju knew that the mobilisation was a king of national plebiscite. They took reassurance from the size of the force that answered their call, as well as from the vast tribute they received in the form of livestock. Grain and drink along the way, feast boosted morale. They also confirmed the status of Menelik and Tadju as generous patrons of the army and the nation. Parents, even, who could be counted on to protect and provide for the children of Ethiopia. By the time the Emperor Red Tent was erected at Lake Esenji in mid-December, Menelik had amassed a force of more than 100,000. Confident in high spirits, equipped with modern firearms, including artillery, and outnumbered the Italian forces by more than 4-1. Menelik's army was already rewriting the rules of colonial warfare at the same time that he built up his army. Menelik carefully crafted the image he wished to project. Lowball estimates of the size of Menelik's army were leaked. These were eagerly picked up by the Italians. Menelik's court also produced rumours of Marza, that Marconian would betray Menelik for the emperor's crown, that Tekel Hamenot would bolt with his army before he would fight. It was even put about that Menelik has been hit by lightning and struck, dumb, or perhaps killed. Every scrap of news reassured the Italians and bolstered their confidence that they would face a small, fractured and demoralised opponent. The size of the unity of the Menelik II's army was an unpleasant surprise to the Italians. It overran an Italian outpost at Amba Alage and besieged another to Mekelle. This demonstrated that while Italians stayed in fortified positions, the Ethiopian artillery was not strong enough to defeat them. However, at Mekelle, the garrison was forced to surrender the post through lack of water. But Baratieri was receiving reinforcements from Italy, but he was at the limit of his supply lines. On the 13th of February, 2 Tigerian leaders and their contingents defected from the Italian force, leaving it with no local allies at all. These local forces then began to ambush the Italian supplies. Both Baratieri and Menelik II were running low on supplies, but the Italians tried to attack first. by moving forward to a strong position near the Ethiopian camp that would precipitate a battle. They bungled the advance. Their different contingents were separated, and Menelik II's forces won a decisive and complete victory. After the battle, Menelik II held a trump card. Nearly 2,000 Italian prisoners. These men were well treated and used as bargaining chips. Menelik II's demands were met. Italians annulled the Treaty of Wachau, recognised the full independence of Europe, and paid indemnity of $5 million in gold. This money and the prestige associated with the victory helped Menelik II to further modernise the Ethiopian state and to interrogate it with global system as a would-be cool. For example, 1896, Ethiopia joined the International Red Cross Society. Menelik also resumed his conquest of the Muslim peoples to the south and allied with the British to help them defeat the Mahdists in Sudan. Even before Adwa, when the news of the Italian defeat at Amba, a large got out. Anti-colonial Italian students at the University of Rome were heard to shout, "Viva Menelik!" Menelik II's court also became an early incubator of the Pan-Africanism you encounter in Units 3 and 10. The emperor himself did not claim any special place in the leadership of Africa or Africans, but in the fact of the African victory over the Europeans attracted many of those who wanted to see the continent and African people regain their independence. The Haitan Pan-Africanist Benito Sylvian visited the emperor in January 1896. Later, he was at the 1900 Pan-African Conference. Joseph Vitalian, a doctor from the Caribbean, stayed for years in Ethiopia. He attended the Second Pan-African Congress in 1921, where he met William Du Bois, the radical African-American activist who helped to found Pan-Africanism. Thus, there was a direct link between, on the one hand, the independent Ethiopian state and the Ottomanist movement to push for more freedom for Africans, and on the other, those based in the USA and the Caribbean who worked to protect and defend the rights of people of African descent internationally. Adwa also had an impact on the proponents of imperialism. It dealt a blow to their idea of the racialized and inherently inferior African. Harold Marcus has written that. Now Europeans had to rationalize Menelik's victory, and they turned inevitably to the alternate discourse without abandoning nations of racism. Since such an admission would conflict with the teleological of modern European imperialism, instead they characterized Ethiopians as white, and they found several convenient observations upon which to build a new Ethiopian typology. Thus, they select various Ethiopian racial characteristics as evidence to distinguish Ethiopians from other Africans. Most of these were related to military prowess, but they were also related to intelligence. The reason was circular. The Ethiopians had defeated the Europeans, therefore they could not be classed as African in the same way as other Africans were. The triumph was not complete. Menelik II brought peace and respect by giving up the claim to the Red Sea coast. Menelik II is often criticised for this, and much of his criticism is tied up with the issue of relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which is discussed further below. But it's also possible to see Menelik II's decision to keep Ethiopia a landlocked mountainous state as an example of resistance by retreat. Which James C. Scott has written about the context of Southeast Asia. Being landlocked is a way to become harder target of maritime powers, and being mountainous also makes invasion more difficult. When Ethiopia was attacked by Mussolini's Italy in 1935, it was a founder member since 1920 of the League of Nations, and the attack was seen internationally as an invasion of a sovereign state, not a colonial campaign within a sphere of influence. As the Italians' conquest of the Libyan interior. In this period, Italy occupied Ethiopia in 1936, but the emperor was restored in 1941 when the British armies, aided by European resistors, defeated the Italians. British diplomat commitment to restoring the independence of Ethiopia did not waver. Eritrea was incorporated into Ethiopia in 1950-1901, giving it access to the sea again, but Eritrea spent much more of that period in anti-Addis Ababa insurgency. At the time of writing, the relationship between the two states is hostile since Eritrean independence in 1999 internationally recognised in 1993. Ethiopia is once more landlocked. The ongoing historiography of Adwa has been closely linked to the subsequent history of Ethiopia. It was used to strengthen the prestige of the ruling house of a victory for the emperor. When the empire was overthrown by a group of Marxists in the 1960s, the aspect of the battle became less useful, and instead it was seen as victory for national unity over imperialism. When this regime then fell to a more democratic movement, largely dominated by Tigrayans, the role of specific regions in establishing Ethiopian nationality became more apparent. More recent interpretations, such as those put forward in Milker's and Metafera's collection, The Battle of Adwa, attempt to show how Ethiopian national unity was created by a cooperative action of different ethnic groups as a conscious reaction into the recurring ethnic tension that has characterized Ethiopia since the 1990s. Roma and Somalia people who live in Ethiopia are not part of this Amharic elite, often point to the Melek II's career before and after Adwa as an example of the empire building at their expense. Adwa is clearly an example of the open resistance to imperial advance. It also appears to fall into the category of prime resistance, or at least resistance by traditional pre-colonial authorities, yet, as we have seen, the immediate post-war period saw Ethiopia have an impact on the nascent Pan-African movement, which is one component of secondary resistance that joins diverse groups into politically and or bureaucratically structured umbrella organizations. It was also a definite example of success, diplomatic and military resistance. Menelik II's political genius is preserving Ethiopian unity for long enough to win the campaign, enabling to secure a unique result to elude other African rulers to fight back against a European power that was bent on conquest and exploitation. Page 153. They all could have been, so for our purpose, resistance need not necessarily by working towards the immediate and complete end of empire. Many resistors sought amelioration of conditions under colonialism, or more politically autonomy rather than the ultimate independence. Moreover, while some resistors were working on behalf of the nation or wider group, others were working mainly for their families or themselves. We might have understood different answers, which is fine, during the course of study on the unit, which we taught about as case studies and the change your mind, at which could belong, where the important thing to remember is that there is any kind of actions that we can analyse in resistance. What other groups of the Moshashu are successfully paid off against one another? Britain, the Borough Publics, French Protestant missionaries. How effective was his resistance? I could rate it as successful, but not entirely so. He was able to play off the boroughs and the British against each other for some time, but in the end, he forced to accept a protectorate from the British and promised to stay within the territory that was not very fertile. He avoided becoming directly colonised, though. I make it 8 out of 25. Hurrah! It was also be possible to count the reconquest of Sudan at technically the suppression of a rebellion, and the Jameson Raid and the start of Second Anglo-Boer War as rebellion by local British and Boer rule. On the activity 14.4, weapons of the week. Desertion, escaping to neighbouring colonies, Gambia, British or Portuguese. Pretending to work, arson, covert violence against chiefs who try to combat laziness. The impact of ADWA. Points you may have picked up on could include Italian army retreats, Ethiopian army continues to advance, Italian prisoners taken, many Italians wounded, Italian policies toward Ethiopia appears to have changed, Italian people losing enthusiasm from war, Menelik's march to Adwa, keep the political unity of Ethiopia, mobilise as many troops as possible, keep moving to not overburden, be seen to be in command by his people, put out false rumours of division designed to fool the Italians. Look at the introduction on page 163. We have a new chapter. I have you not. Sex, Gender and Empire by Cole Hack, Unit 15. In the unit, I want you to think about how sex was sought and managed, and about the role of gender in imperial situations. For the latter, we need to go beyond the introductory definition offered in Unit 10, a little before I wrote this unit. The UK Office National Statistics ONS has defined gender as a social construction related to behaviours and attributes based on labels of masculinity and femininity. It added that a person's gender was also a personal, internal perception of oneself, and so the gender category someone identifies with may not match the sex they are assigned at birth. Such definitions can be debated and may shift over time, but this one does help to focus our attention on gender's multiple aspects, social, cultural, and intermediately personal. Using the categories of sex and gender, we ask questions such as, did British and subject imaginaries about gender interact? How did ideas of appropriate and exemplary femininity and masculinity related concepts such as the family change over time? How was the sale and purchase of sex managed in colonial settings? In addition, how did gender constructions play a part in a wider imperial social formation? Also, employing race, class, and other categories that was intended to structure social relations and so create and manage hierarchical difference. How were they employed in the hope of altering subject behaviour? Page 164 to 165. Hijras are the good place to start because their story highlights how empire interacted with a range of gender identities, some specific to particular cultures. Most hijras were born male but embodied femininity, sometimes in combination with masculinity. In terms of dress and behaviour, some underwent a characteristic castration ceremony in which male genitalia were removed as offering to a Hindu goddess Bahuchara Mata. They might perform, give blessings and collect congratulatory donations, known as the Badara on occasions such as marriages and birthdays. Indian governments attempts to control hijras, intensifying from the 1860s onwards, show how gender can get wrapped up in wider imperial anxieties and in desires to demonstrate moral governance by reform. These years were characterised by official worries about criminal tribes and castes, including hydras, the labelled eunuchs by the authorities. The increase of restrictions on hydras followed early suppression of Thuggee highway robbery combined with strangulation, which company official William Sleeman fantasized was due to be organised caste in service of to the goddess Kali on Wayne 2004. A threat, murderous highway robbery was thus embellished. The search for criminal groups also reflected beliefs applied in Britain too. The criminal propensities might be inherent in individuals in endangered classes, something reflecting contemporary interest in phrenology, measuring skulls to link characteristics to appearances, knowledge entrepreneurs like Sleeman and others, whether Indian or British, could fuel such fears and shape occurrences into the spectre of a whole classes of miscreants, as happened to the Hydrids. In this case, some high-profile case of child abduction contributed to government in characterising Hydrids as corrupting. So responses to gender could be as much about preserved deviant order and control as about gender per se. Furthermore, the British response can be seen as an instance of a reforming instinct. They had earlier tried to reduce infanticide and 1829 had banned sati, the custom of the widow burning herself for her husband's funeral pyre. Under the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act, anyone publicly displaying behaviour defined as Hydra related risked being registered and banned from associated practices. Yet Hydra survived and have been recognised as a third sex in modern India. So gender categories can be made, can be messy, and interventions problematic. We also need to remember the norms can shift. For instance, the age of consent for girls in India for most of the period covered by this unit was 10 and 12. In England, it was 12 up to 1875 and 13 up to 1885, when it increased to 16 following a press campaign against child prostitution combined with purity campaigning. Over late 19th century, in addition, middle-class attitudes to male sexuality changed in England, from accepting of natural urges and a double standard that urged tighter control over sexual behaviour in women, towards an emphasis of greater self-control. I started this way to highlight the range of complexity of questions thrown up by the theme of sex, gender and empire, and the way Metropole and Connolly interacted according as scholars, helping to constitute each other, hence domestic burgoyes, liberal, evangelical and missionary nations, to appropriate domesticity and sexuality, for instance, interacted with thinking about the Caribbean, India and Africa. Britishness was bound up by the notions of empire and being free, if not born, to rule. Cooper and Stoller even claim that Europe was made by imperial projects at the same time as it reshaped overseas subjects.